I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This week I'm speaking to biologist and ecologist Sophie Leguil. Sophie is an outspoken and passionate advocate for nature, plants and wildlife and can often be found on social media, helping make sense of complex concepts that affect gardeners and their outdoor spaces. We talk a bit about public spaces, a bit about gardens and urban areas, and we touch upon what can happen when you try to stand up for what you believe in. Unlike some people, I don't want to shut Sophie up. I want to play a part in amplifying her voice, so I'm delighted she was able to take part in this interview. She starts by telling us how she became involved in gardens and green spaces.
So basically, I'm a botanist by training. I've loved plants, since I was probably 3 or 4 years old. And initially I was, considering possibly going into more agricultural and engineering. And I started by studying that, and I quickly realized that what I was really interested in was, the natural world and plants in particular. So I ended up doing a BSc and an MSc in botany. And, well, when I finished my MSc, I really couldn't find a job because I studied in Belgium and I didn't speak Dutch or Flemish, so I was a bit stuck. And I moved to the UK, and very quickly I found a job in horticulture and more particularly in conservation. So I worked for the charity Plant Heritage, conserving, all sorts of plants, so from species to horticultural cultivars throughout the UK, and it was a really interesting job. So I travelled, around the UK. I visited gardens, national plant collections, and I found it, really interesting and really eye-opening job. Especially, it opened my eyes to the world of, plant conservation and all the challenges that come with that. So I left the job after 6 years. And I've decided to become, a consultant. So I work as a botanical and ecological consultant. I also do other things like botanical travel. So I lead botanical tours. And I translate horticultural and botanical books as well. So I've got quite a varied sort of skills panel. And I'm passionate on a sort of side note about urban ecology. And as a result of, living in London for 6 years, I've decided to launch this project called More Than Weeds, which I'm sure you'll hear more about later.
Definitely. So you've got More Than Weeds. You've also got another website. Can you talk about that as well? Yeah,
so Naturonauts, which was sort of a contraction between nature and some sort of, cosmonauts or something like that. So the idea was really travel in nature and a journey in nature. So I launched that website when I was still in Belgium, and it's mostly a blog, and it sort of showcases some of my activities. And really, what started as a blog to show my pictures of nature and walks in the countryside or in nature reserves, kind of transitioned into a more controversial blog. And I really like studying some issues in depth. So I've been posting, about issues like brownfields, conservation. I've been posting some issues about particular sites as well, which are threatened with development. So I really like, studying an issue in depth, and trying also what I really like, as a scientist, and I've got a background as a scientist, but I really like communicating about science and about issues. So I try to research scientific articles, but then, translate it into something that can be read by anyone. So I'm really keen on, bridging that gap between science and more, raising awareness and general public.
Yeah, you do that very well. In fact, you do an excellent job communicating with people on social media. But occasionally, I think because you stick your head above the parapet a little bit, you sometimes face a backlash. And I was thinking back to you when you tweeted about the stalks at Knepp Castle Estate, and that caused a bit of a furore. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was really surprised actually, by the backlash I got. Some of it was public. I also did get some abuse, in private messages, which I was really shocked about. So the issue with NAP, and stalks and rewilding in general, I think it's the stalks, but there's also been, other projects, reintroduction projects in the UK. And to me, the reaction I had to the stalk project, I think, rewilding is something really fantastic and positive because it catches people's attention and, the UK is one of the most nature depleted places in the world. So really, bringing back some natural states and some natural habitats would be fantastic. But something like the stalk project, I had arguments against it, or some things that were really bothering me about the project. And one of them was about the fact that stalks are predators. So where I come from the northeast of France, and it's one of the regions in Europe where, the stalk concentration is very high. They almost disappeared in the 1970s there, and they were brought back through a reintroduction project. So they started breeding them, creating nests for them on houses and things like that. And now the stalks are actually causing problems because they are so numerous. Stalks, we always say, they feed on amphibians and crayfish and things like that, but actually they'll eat anything. So in Alsace, in my area, they've actually been eating some birds' chick. So they're eating, for example, curlew chicks, which is, it's a protected bird, a threatened bird, and they've been eating those. They can feed on bins. So in Germany, they've had problems with, stalks feeding on bins and destroying bins, for example. So they're really, quite, they're predators. And to me, the idea of bringing them, without, having an idea of what they're going to feed on, whether there is enough food for them, or whether, there might be threatening, frog populations in the southeast, for example. It was just criticism just to criticize. It's really because I've got the concern about whether it's the right thing to do at the right time. Shouldn't we be rewilding more of the UK or focusing more on species which are already there? I think what I'm also concerned about is the whole, vocabulary and how the communication about it. So you've probably seen, newspaper articles and website articles saying it's how wonderful it is for stalks to be nesting and the fact that they're a flagship species. They're big, they're beautiful. They haven't been in the UK. We don't really know when they were nesting, and if they were nesting. There's a concern about that as well. People say there is evidence that they've been nesting, but to me the evidence is quite scarce. That's a personal opinion. Some people might disagree, obviously, but really the idea about using them as a flagship species, something that draws people to conservation, I don't know if it's the right idea because, the UK has got so many threatened birds, insects, so shouldn't we be focusing on those first before, working on something so big and pretty? And it's a dilemma, that happens in tropical conservation as well. We talk about the panda. It's a typical example of should we be, focusing all our efforts on the panda, but the panda brings money. It's usually, the way things work. But I don't know. It was a personal opinion, but I saw, things like having evidence about what happens in the rest of Europe would be, something that could bring people to reflect about the project. And actually, I got a lot of personal backlash. People saying "go home," which was not expected.
No. I mean, we do have a bit of a propensity to favour the novel and the unusual, and obviously the media is always looking for something that generates interest. And if you've got something that's a bit unusual and glamorous like a stalk, then, like you say, people latch onto it and they use that to sell other, the concept of rewilding or conservation as a whole. What is completely unacceptable is that you faced such an attack from people, especially given your position as, an expert. So, that was very disappointing to see. And we need a lot less of that. We need an actual reasoned debate about the effects of what we're doing in terms of conservation and in our gardens. So on that topic, I noticed also Chris Packham had recently, I think he retweeted something about meadows and wildflowers. And that's something that's come up on the podcast in the past. And I think that's something that you've got an opinion on as well, based on fact. But sometimes we kind of see these pictures bandied about of wildflower verges and meadows. When they are wildflowers, they might just not necessarily be wildflowers that we would normally find in this country that are endemic to it. So what's the problem with kind of glamorising these flower meadows over, promoting, protecting our existing wildflower meadows?
Yeah, I mean, the issue with White Flower Meadow really, there was a bit of a Twitter storm. For anyone who's on Twitter, there was a real Twitter storm a few months ago, and it started again with a tweet by Chris Packham. Really, whoever posted, whether it's Chris Packham or not another naturalist, it's not a personal criticism again, but really, I think we should be having a discussion about those White Flower Meadows. They keep sprouting around the UK. Councils are really liking them because it's sort of a quick win really. People find them really pretty, but as you said, there are many issues with the White Flower Meadows. So I started doing a bit of research using scientific articles, and I wrote a blog post on that. And I found that there are numerous issues. So one of them is obviously the fact that many of those seed mixes, which are being sold. So when you look at the seed packet, they're being sold as a white flower meadow, but actually they're not wild. Many of those plants, or at least they're wild in the UK, many of those plants are not native. So you'll find, a lot of the time you'll find North American plants, because they're really easy to grow from seed and they grow quickly in the UK. You'll find also the fact that many of the seeds don't come from the UK, but come from Mediterranean area. So they produce a lot of seed packets in Spain and south of France and Italy. And there are other issues. For example, the fact that to sow those meadows, you actually have to use glyphosate, and it's a manufacturer's or seed producer recommendation. Some people, when I said that on Twitter, were really shocked. They assumed that, because it looks so pretty, it must have, been sort of nature friendly and biodiverse and ecological. But actually, the process of sowing those, you have to eliminate all the plants which were there before. And the official, recommendation is to use weed killer on the soil before you can sow those. So, it's not as nature friendly as it seems. And the other thing as well is they're usually sold as being good for insects. But when you look in details, if you search, for insects on those plants, you'll find bees, honeybees, because they're generalists. But some of the more, specific insects, many of our insects in the UK are linked to only one plant. Some caterpillars, for example, only feed on nettle. So if you remove the nettle, well, you won't have that particular plant. So, and when you've got North American plants in those mixes, for example, they may not have any native insects being able to feed on them. So they look very pretty, but they may not have, as many insects benefits as there are being sold about. So I think my issue, if people want to sow those in their garden, in a patch in their garden, that's fine. To me, it's like a modern version of Victorian bedding. It's a more sort of natural-looking version of bedding. So really, I don't think we should be banning them. They've got a purpose, and they look pretty. Some people even sow them in a window box, a container. But my issue is when councils and companies start to sell those, for white flower verges. And for example, there's been the example of Rotherham, which has been sowing miles and miles of those white flower mixes. And somehow my issue with that is that it skews people's vision. So when you look, under those pictures, there are comments of people saying, "Oh, this looks so much better than our native, boring, grassy verges." And to me, this is when it starts becoming a problem because, it distracts people from actual conservation. So we always hear about, 97% of the meadows in the UK have disappeared. It's quite a shocking statistic, really. And people think that those sort of white flower pretty mixes are going to replace those, which, it's not true. It doesn't replace, a functioning sort of ecosystem. And those mixes also have to be, resown every year as well. A lot of the time, they're annual. So I think it's, my real issue is with all that debate is, what we're doing of it, and not mixing gardening with conservation. Really, this is my issue with those mixes. And again, this is something I've been trying to convey on Twitter, and people are very dismissive. When you just try to make a sort of a valid point, like glyphosate. So you've got people who campaign against glyphosate, but who seem to be supporting those mixes for some reason. It's just about being logical and being aware of what you're using and how you're using nature, really.
So I think probably as I don't know, what came first? Was it your worry about wildflowers, or was it the More Than Weeds project? Was the More Than Weeds project a kind of response to the fact that people thought maybe our wildflowers were boring and were more concerned with flowery meadows?
Well, the More Than Weeds project was inspired by a project in France. So when I lived in France, I was involved in a project called Sauvage de Marie, which translates as White Plants of My Street. And the idea behind that project was to, change people's perception of, plants growing on pavements, weeds in flower beds, in gardens, in parks, urban weeds in general. And I thought, when I moved back to London, I thought there is, such a gap. We always talk about conservation in nature park, the countryside. Even when you look at TV programs, for example, there are very few which talk about urban wildlife and urban plants in particular. And I thought, there is a gap. Certainly, there are so many people now live in cities, and more are going to be living in cities. And we talk about health, well-being, parks, but we don't talk about the nature that is in, people's streets under our nose, through your window. So that's sort of how the More Than Weeds project came to be. I do think there is an overlap with, the white flower issue, because to me, we have to educate people about the nature around them. So if you're on the countryside, you may go to a nature reserve, and you wouldn't expect to see North American plants in there. You'd expect to see, orchids, chalk flora, depending on, whatever, depending on where you are. And to me, educating urban citizens, urban residents, about what's around them, the plants might not look as interesting, or, they might not look as spectacular as an orchid on a mountain in Wales. But, they have a history, they have a role to play. And the idea was really to, open people's eyes to that. And, for example, I've seen, some cities or some towns around the UK replacing, their verges with those white flower mixes. And to me, it's a shame because, it would be an opportunity to educate their local residents to what grows naturally there. And when you stop mowing, in many places, when you stop mowing as regularly as many councils do, they mow every 2 weeks or whatever. If you stop mowing, then you may have, a whole range of plants coming up. It might not be, exciting plants with large flowers, but it would be such a good opportunity, to educate people. And when I started, chalking plant names on pavements to educate people, I had people on the street say to me, "Oh, I had no idea that this plant was called this." And so I think it's just, bringing plants to people's attention. We always talk about plant blindness, the fact that people, don't see plants. And to me, that's really, something that More Than Weeds is about.
Yeah, I really like that, because you can take the opportunity to celebrate the things around you and even take a little bit of ownership and be proud of what you're, is kind of in your surroundings. Do you chalk the names using the the botanical name, or do you use the common names or both?
I've used a combination. I have to say it depends on how much time you have, how much space there is, because people need to be able to, read the name, and also the substrate. Some pavements are more difficult to chalk on than others. So it depends. But, I've seen places where they've chalked whether the plant is edible or not, for example. So you can chalk a whole range of facts, things like that. One of the issues I've been thinking about, doing trails where you could go around and find out more information about the plant. But the problem is they get, cut or sprayed very, very quickly by the chemicals. So it wouldn't be a very lasting trail, sadly.
No, that's true. Yeah, I never thought about that. So it's a bit of an ephemeral thing. And can anyone do it? Can anyone take part?
Well, the chalking, in theory, is illegal in the UK. I've managed to ask several councils, so it's a question of if people want to do it. Either you do it, sort of guerrilla style, and you don't care about, what you might be fined or whatever. The risks are very, very low, but the risk is there. So, I can't be seen as saying to people it's fine and okay legally. I've seen people do it, without any issues. And with the coronavirus, we've seen a lot of people chalking for the NHS, rainbows, things like that. But another option, which is quite good, I think, as well, is to possibly talk to your council, or if it's a private land, talk to your to the landowner and explain, what you're doing and why you're doing it. I've had some, quite good response from some councils saying, "Oh, this is like an interesting idea." Basically, it's free education, really.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
So they might be interested in the initiative as well as allowing it. So.
It's not like it does. It's not like it never rains in England. It's not going to get, it's likely to get washed off sooner or later.
Yeah, from my experience, it depends on how much footfall there is, but it lasts anywhere between 1 to 3 or 4 days. Roughly.
Yeah, so it's not exactly damaging graffiti.
No, it's not graffiti. It's not graffiti. I think it's their main worry that it's going to be seen as graffiti, but really, I don't think they should be worried.
Fair enough. I was going to ask you as well about one of the things that I read of yours that got me very, very angry. And I don't get upset. Normally, I just get angry, and I got furious about this. But it was the site at Warren Farm, and it is upsetting. If you read the blog post about it, it really is, not nice. But I wondered if maybe you could talk about that, what had gone on there, and what's happening on the site now, if you know.
Yeah, I do know a little bit. Warren Farm, literally, I went there for the first time last year, a year on. And really, this site, so basically it's a large site which used to be football pitches. And about 7 or 8 years ago, QPR, the football club, decided to create a new training ground with new football pitches, a new training centre on it. And I think it was leased by Eden Council. So it's in northwest London, and the site is, it's not very far from central London, when you look at Greater London as a whole, as a region. And what happened is, because of that legal battle, which has been going on, people didn't want the site to become private because it was, open space and free open spaces. It used to be just known to, create football pitches. But as a result of the legal process, the site became completely rewilded. So they still, cut it for biodiversity once a year or twice a year. But the site, became wild. And to me, when I visited that site last year, it was a bit of a revelation. It was, an ecological experiment. To me, as an ecologist, it was really exciting because it shows the potential, that a site like an urban site really, can have if you leave nature with minimal management to do its thing. So I did an insect survey over there last year, looking at plants as well. And I found, a whole range of protected species. So they've got lots of protected birds like skylarks, which nest a couple of miles away from central London, which is quite remarkable. Sadly, the site was threatened as part of the football pitches and the football training centre development. So the news on the site a year on is that QPR officially abandoned the project, which is good news in a way. Sadly, the council is still, from what I've heard, the council is still interested in building artificial grass football pitches, basically, on the sites, and new sports facilities and things like that. So I don't know the details because I'm not as local to the area. But really, to me, this is the sort of site that could become, or at least part of the site could become a nature reserve, and it could become, as I said, it's an ecological experiment. It's not something that can be done, or there are many examples of that around London. London has been losing many of its habitats, so grasslands, for example, wetlands along the Thames, and there are so many certain plants and insect species. You don't realise it. You kind of think, well, it's London, it's urbanised anyway, there's nothing to save. But it's not true. There are remarkable habitats, remnants of it, scattered around. And I think it's a real shame, that there hasn't been more support and when I wrote that blog post, the response I got was very emotional. I wrote it on the train back from visiting one farm. And I got such a response to it. People were saying this is such an emotional, blog post, and I started crying on the train. It doesn't happen very often, that I start crying when I visit the site. But to me, this is, it represents, everything that could be done right for nature, in London and the UK in general.
Mm. Yeah, I think I really would urge people to go and read it. It is. It's a brilliant post. And it also just highlights what a mockery it is to have protected species if it's fine to just go and flatten the land anyway. What is the point? But that did make me think, and I know probably like the rest of us, you're not that sure what's going to happen going forwards, but given the sort of the government that we have at the moment and Brexit, how do you see the future of the UK wildlife faring under sort of political changes, or even if things stay the same?
Well, I think, we've got so little, certitude of what's going to happen. Nobody knew in January last year that 2020 would be like this. You see what I mean? And I think the Brexit is sort of similar. We've seen some papers from the government, mainly about agriculture, but there are so many things, that we don't exactly know what's gonna happen. Whether it's actually with agriculture, the details, of the agricultural bill and how, farming subsidies for biodiversity are going to work. For example, we don't know that yet. In terms of biodiversity in general, obviously Britain is not going to fall under the EU directive. So the main ones, which are the Birds Directive and the Habitats Directive, are not going to apply anymore in the UK after the 1st of January. So really, we don't know whether the UK is going to take a strong stance and say we want to go further than what the EU did in terms of protection, or whether it's going to be a route to deregulation. From what we've seen, it hasn't been particularly reassuring. You've probably heard the thing about nudes, where they said, that nude counting was an obstacle to. I can't remember who said it was. Yeah, who said that? But they said, that nude counting was an obstacle to planning. And, nude counting, which, newts are protected species, under EU law, it's the problem is if you say something like that, it's not particularly reassuring to, ecologists and so it's a good sign to developers. So I'm not too hopeful, I have to say. And I know many people in the profession who aren't. But it's just a question of, really what happens, and also what happens with the economic situation, really. So,
yeah. And what can we do? Can we get in contact with anyone?
Well, I think, really, if you've got a strong stance and a strong opinion, really trying to campaign both on the local ground. People have been campaigning, for example, against the destruction caused by HS2. But even, a local campaign at Warren Farm, which is something quite small and quite local. The impact is quite local. But on the other hand, when you think about it, all the small local projects have got an impact on the ecology of the UK as a whole. So really, I would say if you've got something small going on, development, try to get involved, try to, find advice as well. The team at Warren Farm last year, they were looking for people, to help with insect surveys. We wouldn't have known that the site was so rich if we hadn't had, me going on looking for insects and other going for birds or plants. So I think, knowing what's on the site and trying to get in touch with the right people is very important. That's what I would try, to say to people. When I see that, for example, I'm going back to, the wildflower meadows, and something, to me really important is don't destroy what's already there. If you've got something like a lawn with nothing in there, on topsoil, then perhaps, a wildflower meadow or a seed mix is the right thing to do. It's not going to destroy much. But, so many councils are just saying, oh, it was just lawn. It's not a problem. But actually, in London, I've seen some areas of grassland, really important grassland with, small plants in there being destroyed, just to plant those seed mixes. So I think it's about, knowing what's there and making the right thing for nature. You wouldn't cut a tree because you think, oh, there may be a bird nesting. You won't cut a tree in April because you think there may be a bird nesting. And it's the same thing, with removing some part of your garden or for a council. To try to do a quick survey just to find out what's there already, and see if you can improve it. If not, then maybe, try and do something else, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the idea. Yeah.
Yeah, 100% agree. I mean, that's one of my policies now is not to do anything unless I know I'm absolutely improving things. So biodiversity audits all round cost, I think, about £750. I've got one happening tomorrow. It's a no-brainer. It's a big site. There's things here. There's a pond here. There's like potentially meadows with some history behind them. I'm not going to go ploughing into it because I don't know what's there and I don't know if I'm just going to make a mess. So it's absolutely, you're right. Knowledge is power, and we need to take responsibility before just assuming that we're always doing the right thing and that we're always improving things, because sometimes we're just not. So I couldn't agree more. I think sometimes I think I've seen a tweet recently where you've quoted something that John Little's done, who is a previous podcast guest and does a lot of work involving brownfields. And also I saw a blog post on your site where you were talking about the kind of public perception of brownfield and greenfield and why one is more favoured than the other for building purposes. Is there anything you want to kind of talk about around that?
I think it goes back to some of the things I've said previously. I think really, when you hear, housing minister or whoever, politician saying, oh, we have to build on brownfield, and some charities, that Bug Life, and some local charities have been, trying to make people and politicians realize really that brownfields, it's a human construct. So, we've been opposing brownfields as something bad. When you talk about brownfield, people automatically assume it's, industrial land, wasteland, polluted land, something like that. And then greenfield is green pastures, rolling hills and trees and that sort of thing, which in reality is, it's very different, Though in greenfield, you'll find industrial estates. And you can find, green areas in brownfield land. And when you look at the details, actually, in the UK, brownfield land in many parts of, the UK is actually richer than any other habitat. So even around London, I've seen some brownfield land, which has a huge diversity of habitats. And this is linked to, the past users. So for example, if you've got a derelict brick building, then you may have some solitary bees being able to nest in the bricks. And you may have a pile of, wood where you'll have small mice and mammals and other mammals being able to nest in them. And then you get huge open areas where, with a bit of scrub and shrubs, where skylights might be able to, feed and nest as well. So to me, it's really, that human construct of brown bad and green good, which we have to challenge. As an ecologist, it's something, we have to challenge. And, it makes me very sad when I see all the building targets, focusing on brownfield, because actually, some of the agricultural land in the UK, which would be deemed greenfield, is very poor. It's land that has been dosed in pesticides. And actually, building those places in the right way, building with biodiversity in mind, using hedges, using, ponds, green roofs, whatever, might actually improve the biodiversity of those places. So I know it's not necessarily a popular opinion. Some people say we shouldn't be building on agricultural land at all. We should be, keeping that land. But when you think about, biodiversity, species and conservation, actually you have to rethink that. And it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but this is, what it is. So, with my dog blockers, that's, again, what I was trying to make that point using, research. And the fact that, 40% of solitary bees nesting in brownfield land, for example, it's huge.
Again, it just comes back to that idea that we need to stop steamrolling through everything and take a breath and find out what's actually there and find out what we've got. But of course, that's in no one's interest who's earning money. So I don't see that happening anytime soon, because it's always about the money, isn't it? A very big thank you to Sophie for taking part, and thanks to you for listening. A big shout out to my lovely Patreon supporters and to those of you who donate via GoFundMe. You are all marvellous human beings and I appreciate you. I'm going to leave you with Dr. Ian Bedford talking about some extraterrestrial looking creatures. Two things struck me after speaking to Sophie about Ian's segment. The first is that there are tiny organisms going about their business, some of which we know next to bugger all about, and some we don't even know exist yet. And the second was that the planet doesn't need us silly humans on it. We're a significant but not indisposable inconvenience, and life will continue long after we're gone, just not necessarily as we know it.
We only have to look around our gardens to realise that there's a vast and diverse array of creatures that live alongside us, and that their basic requirements for survival are usually very similar to ours. However, during recent years, organisms have been discovered that were very different, because they were surviving in environments that would be lethal for all other known life forms on Earth. Discovering these organisms was not only surprising, but of great interest and value to modern-day science. From heat and pressure-resistant bacteria discovered in hot volcanic vents deep under the oceans, to rock algae growing in the coldest regions of Antarctica, these organisms thrived. And so, not surprisingly, they were called extremophiles. And quite incredibly, one of these extremophiles is a tiny group of invertebrates, closely related to insects, that are called the tardigrades. Tardigrades are less than 1 millimetre in length, sausage-shaped, and have 4 pairs of stumpy clawed legs and a large round mouth that they use to vacuum up microscopic prey into their almost transparent bodies. And now that we know about tardigrades, the more we look, the more species are found from virtually anywhere around the world, with over 1,000 having been recorded so far, from hot springs in America to the top of the Himalayas, and from the sediment at the bottom of the deepest oceans to within layers of polar ice. And also in ponds, meadows, and even in our gardens here in Britain, where they can be found living within moss and algae. But what makes tardigrades an extremophile is their ability to survive extreme conditions by using a biological process that hasn't been seen before in any other organism. They're able to change the water in their bodies into a sugar that preserves them during periods of extreme cold and drought. And the effectiveness of this process was demonstrated by tardigrades that were found to have survived for over 100 years amongst museum material. And more recently by tardigrades that survived a 12-day experiment within the cold vacuum of outer space. In fact, continued research into the lives of these tiny creatures has discovered that some species can withstand temperatures down to minus 272 Celsius and up to 150 degrees Celsius, while others survived atmospheric pressures 6 times greater than those found in the deepest oceanic trenches, and others were unaffected by radiation levels hundreds of times higher than the lethal dose for humans. And so, consequently, it's been suggested that tardigrades are likely to live through a complete global mass extinction event, and would therefore supersede the cockroach's reputation as the ultimate survivor by a very wide margin.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.